March 17, 1984. 300 miles southwest of Iceland, 400 meters beneath the North Atlantic's dark surface. Captain Second Rank Viktor Sherov's hands trembled as he gripped the periscope housing of his Project 671 RTM Victor III submarine. The sound had started 10 minutes ago, a deep pulsing throb that seemed to penetrate the hull itself, pressing against his eardrums like a physical force. Through the green glow of the sonar display, his operators sat frozen, their faces pale in the darkness. Senior Lieutenant Mikhail Dratvin ripped off his headphones with a gasp, blood trickling from his left ear. The 42-year-old captain had spent 20 years beneath the waves. He had evaded NATO destroyers in the Norwegian Sea, played cat and mouse with American submarines off the Kola Peninsula, survived depth charge attacks during training exercises. Nothing had prepared him for this. The American sonar wasn't searching for him. It was announcing his presence, declaring that his submarine, painted with the latest anechoic coating, running on silent propulsion at 4 knots, supposedly invisible in the thermal layers of the Atlantic, had already been found. What Sherov didn't know was that he was hearing the future of submarine warfare, a technology so powerful it would make Soviet operational doctrine obsolete within 5 years. Within 6 months, his confident belief that Soviet submarines could hide in the vastness of the ocean would transform into the crushing realization that nowhere in the world's seas was truly safe anymore. The story begins not with technology, but with doctrine. Throughout the Cold War, Soviet submarine strategy rested on a fundamental assumption that the ocean was vast enough to hide in. Soviet naval intelligence had calculated that the Atlantic Ocean contained approximately 324 million cubic kilometers of water. American anti-submarine forces, they reasoned, could never search more than a tiny fraction of that volume. Soviet Project 667 BDR Delta III ballistic missile submarines could patrol silently in remote areas, maintaining their nuclear deterrent while remaining effectively invisible. Attack submarines like Sherov's Victor III class could intercept NATO convoys or stalk American carrier groups while staying undetected for weeks at a time. The mathematics seemed irrefutable. Even if American destroyers searched 100 square miles per hour, they would need decades to sweep a single ocean basin. Soviet submariners had been taught that their greatest weapon was not their torpedoes or missiles, but the ocean itself. The crushing depths, the thermal layers that bent sound waves, the background noise of biologics and merchant shipping that masked their propellers. This confidence was built on experience. During exercises in the 1970s, Soviet submarines routinely evaded NATO hunter-killer groups for days at a time. In 1976, Captain First Rank Anatoly Sherov had navigated his Project 667, a Yankee-class submarine, through an entire carrier battle group formation without detection, surfacing 200 miles away to radio his success back to Northern Fleet headquarters. Soviet naval doctrine divided the ocean into safe zones and dangerous zones. Dangerous zones were within 50 miles of NATO bases or active shipping lanes. Safe zones were everywhere else, the vast blue desert where submarines could patrol with near impunity. The American military saw the problem differently. By 1980, Soviet submarine production had reached crisis levels for NATO planners. The Soviet Union operated 378 submarines, including 62 ballistic missile boats capable of destroying American cities. Each year, Soviet shipyards launched 15 to 20 new submarines. American naval intelligence estimated that in a shooting war, Soviet submarines would sink half of all NATO supply convoys crossing the Atlantic within the first 30 days. The United States Navy had anti-submarine warfare aircraft, surface ships with towed arrays, and attack submarines of its own, but the mathematics remained brutal. There was simply too much ocean and too many Soviet submarines. Traditional sonar operated on a principle called passive detection. Ships and submarines listened for the sounds of enemy vessels, their propellers and machinery radiating noise into the water. But Soviet engineers had made their submarines quieter with every generation. The Victor III class that Sherov commanded produced only 108 decibels of radiated noise, barely louder than background ocean sounds. Detection ranges had shrunk from 20 miles in the 1960s to less than 10 miles by 1980. At that range, finding a submarine in the Atlantic was like finding a specific car in North America by listening for its engine. The United States needed a different approach. Instead of listening for submarines, they would shout at them. The concept of active sonar was not new. Surface ships had used it since World War II, sending out powerful pings and listening for echoes bouncing off enemy hulls, but traditional active sonar faced severe limitations. High-frequency sound waves traveled only a few miles before dissipating. Low-frequency sound traveled farther but required enormous arrays and power supplies that surface ships could not carry. The physics seemed to impose an iron limit. Active sonar might work at 5 or 10 miles, but never at the ranges needed to search ocean basins. Then in 1978, a team at the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington proposed something radical. Instead of trying to fit powerful sonar onto ships, they would tow it behind them. A massive array of acoustic emitters and receivers, 3,000 feet long, trailing 2 miles behind specially built ocean surveillance ships. The arrays would transmit at frequencies between 100 and 500 Hz, so low that the sound waves could travel through water for hundreds of miles without significant attenuation. The system would be called SIRTUS, the Surveillance Towed Array Sensor System. It would change everything. The first TAGOS ocean surveillance ship, the USNS Stalwart, deployed to the Atlantic in October 1984. The ship looked nothing like a warship. At 224 feet long and displacing only 2,300 tons, it resembled a commercial fishing trawler with an oversized crane on the stern. But that crane served a very specific purpose. It deployed and recovered the twin-towed arrays, each one containing 96 hydrophones and low-frequency emitters, arranged in a configuration that took the Navy 5 years to perfect. The arrays themselves cost $14 million each. The Stalwart could tow them at speeds up to 3 knots, creating a moving surveillance zone that stretched across 50 miles of ocean. When the arrays transmitted, they pumped 235 decibels of sound into the water. To understand that number, consider that normal conversation measures 60 decibels, a rock concert reaches 120 decibels, and a jet engine at takeoff produces 140 decibels. But the decibel scale is logarithmic. Every increase of 10 decibels represents a 10-fold increase in intensity. The SIRTUS arrays were producing sound 1 trillion times more intense than a jet engine, focused into narrow beams that could penetrate thousands of feet of water and travel across entire ocean basins. The Stalwart began operations in the North Atlantic in November 1984, working in coordination with the fixed SOSUS arrays that had been listening to Soviet submarines since the 1950s. Within 3 weeks, the ship had detected and tracked 47 Soviet submarines. Captain First Rank Boris Bagdasarian commanded a Project 667 BDRM Dolphin-class ballistic missile submarine on deterrent patrol 600 miles north of the Azores, when his sonar operator reported the first ping. It was December 8, 1984. The submarine was running at 3 knots at a depth of 300 meters, trailing a communications buoy that extended to within 50 meters of the surface. Bagdasarian was reviewing patrol reports when Senior Lieutenant Grigory Morozov burst into the command compartment, his face ashen. The sonar contact was unlike anything in Soviet recognition databases. The frequency was too low for traditional active sonar, but the intensity was impossible. Morozov estimated the source was at least 150 miles away, perhaps more. Bagdasarian ordered the submarine deeper and increased speed to 6 knots, changing course by 40 degrees to the west. The pinging continued. Every 12 minutes, a new pulse would arrive, each one seeming to lock onto his position despite his maneuvers. After 6 hours, Bagdasarian made a decision that would later be studied at every Soviet submarine school. He surfaced the boat and transmitted an emergency flash message to Northern Fleet headquarters. The message was simple: new American detection system operating. Request immediate return to base. What Bagdasarian couldn't have imagined was that his submarine was one of 19 Soviet boats detected that day by the growing fleet of TAGOS ships and their SIRTUS arrays. The technology behind SIRTUS represented a revolution in acoustic physics. Traditional sonar faced a problem called the convergence zone. Sound waves in the ocean bend as they travel through water of different temperatures and densities. High-frequency waves bend sharply and dissipate quickly. Low-frequency waves bend gradually, creating zones where sound can travel enormous distances. The SIRTUS arrays operated at frequencies specifically chosen to exploit these convergence zones. A pulse transmitted at 200 Hz would travel downward and outward, bending through the thermocline, reflecting off the ocean floor or surface, and converging at specific distances that depended on water temperature and depth. In the North Atlantic, the first convergence zone occurred at approximately 35 miles, the second at 70 miles, the third at 105 miles, the fourth at 140 miles. By timing the return echoes precisely, SURDAS operators could determine not just that a submarine was present, but exactly how far away it was and what course it was following. The arrays received return signals at 192 separate hydrophones arranged in a pattern that allowed triangulation with stunning accuracy. A Soviet submarine 300 miles away would produce a detectable echo. At 100 miles, the system could identify the specific class of submarine by its acoustic signature. At 50 miles, it could count individual propeller blades. Soviet submariners began comparing notes during crew rotations at Polyarny Naval Base in early 1985. Captain second-rank Yevgeny Vanin had encountered the mysterious sonar southeast of Greenland. Captain Lieutenant Igor Kurdin reported similar experiences in the Norwegian Sea. Captain third-rank Dmitry Polyakov had been tracked for 18 hours straight while transiting from the Barents Sea toward patrol stations in the Atlantic. The reports were disturbing enough that Admiral Chernovin, Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Navy, ordered a formal investigation in February 1985. The Naval Intelligence Directorate collected every encounter report and began analysis. The findings were sobering. American forces were now detecting Soviet submarines at ranges that Soviet naval doctrine had declared impossible. The Americans were not just finding submarines occasionally through luck or intensive searching. They were tracking Soviet boats continuously across thousands of miles of ocean. The system appeared to be operational throughout the North Atlantic, Norwegian Sea, and increasingly in the Pacific. Most troubling was the psychological impact on crews. Soviet submariners had trained for decades with the understanding that their greatest protection was stealth and the vastness of the ocean. Now they felt exposed, vulnerable, like soldiers standing on an open field under enemy observation. The human cost of the SURDAS system extended beyond psychology into physical harm. The intensity of low-frequency active sonar could cause actual damage to human tissue and hearing. In March 1985, Captain Lieutenant Sergei Volkov's Project 671 RTMK submarine was running at 200 meters depth south of Iceland when a SURDAS transmission caught them directly. Volkov later described the sound as like being inside a bell while it was being struck by a hammer the size of a building. 3 of his sonar operators suffered ruptured eardrums. 2 more experienced severe nausea and disorientation that lasted for hours. 1 sailor, Junior Sergeant Pavel Antonov, was thrown from his seat by the force of the vibration and suffered a concussion. The submarine's sensitive electronics flickered and reset. Rubber gaskets in the hull fittings vibrated loose. The boat had to surface and return to base for repairs. Soviet naval medical officers began documenting cases of acoustic shock syndrome among submarine crews. Symptoms included hearing loss, tinnitus, headaches, nausea, and in extreme cases, internal bleeding from ruptured blood vessels near the ears. The Navy issued modified headphones with better padding and filtering, but they could only reduce the impact, not eliminate it. The SURDAS transmissions were so powerful that they penetrated the hull itself, making the entire submarine ring like a tuning fork. The irony was that Soviet engineers had actually developed similar technology years earlier but dismissed it as impractical. In 1977, the Leningrad Underwater Weapons Research Institute had tested a prototype low-frequency active array called Vostok 2. The system worked, detecting submarines at ranges exceeding 80 miles during Black Sea trials. But Soviet admirals rejected the technology for operational use. The arrays were too large and expensive. They required dedicated vessels that would be vulnerable to attack. Most importantly, Soviet doctrine emphasized stealth over detection. Revealing your position by transmitting active sonar contradicted decades of submarine warfare theory. Captain First Rank Alexei Barilachev, who participated in the Vostok 2 evaluation, later recalled arguing that American forces would never accept the tactical disadvantages of active sonar. He had been wrong. What Soviet planners failed to understand was that American strategy was fundamentally different. The United States didn't need to hide its surveillance vessels. They operated in areas of NATO dominance protected by air cover and surface action groups. The tactical disadvantage of revealing their position was irrelevant because they weren't hiding, they were hunting. By mid-1985, the United States had deployed 4 T-AGOS ships with SURDAS arrays. The USNS Stalwart operated in the North Atlantic. The USNS Contender worked the Norwegian Sea. The USNS Vindicator patrolled between Iceland and the United Kingdom. The USNS Triumph operated in the Mediterranean. Together, they created overlapping zones of surveillance that covered the primary transit routes Soviet submarines used to reach the Atlantic. Soviet submarines leaving Polyarny or Severomorsk had to pass through a gauntlet of acoustic detection. Even boats that successfully evaded one array would be picked up by the next. American forces began sharing detection data in near real time. A Surdas ship would detect a submarine transiting past Norway, track it for several hours, then hand off the contact to NATO maritime patrol aircraft that would maintain surveillance with sonobuoys and magnetic anomaly detectors. Soviet submarines that had once moved freely through international waters now faced constant monitoring. Fleet Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, architect of the modern Soviet Navy, reportedly told colleagues that the Americans had turned the ocean transparent. It was not the future he had envisioned when he built the world's largest submarine force. The Soviet response came in multiple forms, each reflecting the desperation of a navy that had lost its fundamental advantage. Research institutions accelerated work on anechoic coatings that could absorb low-frequency sound. The new coatings used layers of rubber embedded with tiny air pockets, each pocket sized to resonate at specific frequencies and cancel out returning echoes. The Project 945 Sierra-class submarines, entering service in 1984, featured titanium hulls coated with the new material. Tests showed a 40% reduction in acoustic return at frequencies below 500 Hz. But 40% was not enough. Surdas could still detect Sierra-class submarines at ranges exceeding 100 miles. The submarines were quieter, but not invisible. Soviet engineers also developed ultra-quiet propulsion systems. The Project 971 Akula-class submarines, first deployed in 1986, used pump-jet propulsors instead of traditional propellers. The design reduced radiated noise to 95 decibels, making them slightly quieter than American Los Angeles-class submarines. Again, it helped, but did not solve the fundamental problem. Surdas was not listening for propeller noise. It was actively illuminating the submarines with sound and detecting the physical return echo from their hulls. The most ambitious Soviet countermeasure was operational rather than technological. Soviet naval intelligence identified the patrol patterns of T-AGOS ships and began routing submarines around them. Long-range maritime reconnaissance aircraft, primarily Tu-142 Bearfob bombers, would locate the American surveillance vessels and transmit their positions to submarine headquarters. Submarines would then plot courses that avoided detection zones by hundreds of miles. This worked initially, but the Americans adapted. By late 1985, T-AGOS ships began operating in randomized patrol boxes, changing course and speed unpredictably. Submarines that thought they had successfully evaded one array would blunder into another. The ocean was becoming a chessboard where the Americans could see the entire board while Soviet players moved blindfolded. Captain second-rank Vladimir Noskov later described it as trying to cross a minefield where the mines move and you cannot see them until they announce your presence to everyone watching. The Americans did not need to sink Soviet submarines. The mere knowledge that every Soviet boat was being tracked achieved the strategic objective. In a shooting war, American attack submarines and aircraft would know exactly where to find their targets. The psychological transformation of Soviet submarine crews accelerated through 1986 and 1987. Men who had volunteered for submarine service specifically because it offered independence and stealth now felt like prisoners being watched by unseen guards. Captain Lieutenant Konstantin Fedisov commanded a Project 877 Polida-class diesel submarine on patrol in the Mediterranean when he encountered Surdas transmissions for the first time in April 1986. Fedisov was 31 years old, a graduate of the Higher Naval Submarine School in Leningrad, considered one of the most promising officers in the Black Sea Fleet. His patrol report, declassified in 2003, describes the experience in stark terms. The American sonar found us at dawn on April 17th. We were running submerged at 8 knots at periscope depth. The first pulse came from the northwest, perhaps 100 kilometers distant. It was not a query. It was a statement. You are here. We know where you are. We can see you. My crew became silent. We completed our patrol, but the knowledge that we were observed the entire time made operational security meaningless. How do you maintain deterrence when the enemy knows your exact position at all times? The broader implications extended beyond tactical submarine operations into strategic nuclear doctrine. Soviet ballistic missile submarines carried the nation's second strike capability. In the event of nuclear war, these submarines would survive the initial American attack and launch retaliatory strikes that would ensure mutual destruction. The entire concept of nuclear deterrence rested on the survivability of the submarine force. But survivability required stealth. A submarine that could be tracked continuously was a submarine that could be destroyed in the opening moments of a conflict. American attack submarines could be pre-positioned along the patrol routes of Soviet missile boats. The moment war began, American torpedoes would eliminate the Soviet deterrent before a single missile launched. Soviet strategic planners began calculating the implications. If Surtas could detect submarines at 200-mile ranges, and if TAGOS ships covered all major transit routes, and if the Americans shared detection data with their attack submarines, then the Soviet ballistic missile submarine force could be neutralized within hours of conflict outbreak. The nuclear balance had shifted dramatically without a single shot being fired. Soviet diplomatic efforts to restrict low-frequency active sonar began in 1986, but gained little traction. Soviet delegates to arms control negotiations proposed including LFA sonar in restrictions on anti-submarine warfare systems. The American position was straightforward. Sonar systems were defensive technologies not subject to arms limitation treaties. The Soviets argued that systems capable of tracking ballistic missile submarines undermined strategic stability. The Americans countered that Soviet submarine expansion had forced NATO to develop better detection technologies. The diplomatic battle continued through the late 1980s without resolution. Meanwhile, the United States continued expanding its fleet of TAGOS ships. By 1988, 18 vessels operated worldwide. The Pacific Fleet received 6 ships that established surveillance zones from the Bering Sea to the South China Sea. Soviet submarines operating from Vladivostok or Petropavlovsk faced the same comprehensive tracking that Atlantic boats had encountered years earlier. The ocean had become transparent globally, not just in the Atlantic. The technical sophistication of Surtas continued advancing throughout the late 1980s. The original arrays operated at fixed frequencies, which allowed Soviet engineers to design countermeasures for those specific wavelengths. The second-generation arrays, deployed beginning in 1987, used frequency-hopping transmissions. Each pulse would transmit at a different frequency within the 100 to 500 Hz range, cycling through a pattern that changed daily. Anechoic coatings designed to absorb sound at 200 Hz were ineffective against pulses at 400 Hz. Soviet countermeasures became obsolete as quickly as they could be deployed. The third-generation arrays added advanced signal processing that could distinguish between submarines and marine life. Whales, which had confused early passive sonar systems, were easily filtered out. The acoustic signature of a steel or titanium hull reflecting low-frequency sound was unmistakable. The system could even distinguish between different submarine classes by analyzing the fine structure of the return echo. A Victor III produced a different echo pattern than an Akula because their hulls had different dimensions and internal structures. American operators could identify specific submarines by their unique acoustic fingerprints. Individual stories from this period reveal the human dimension of technological transformation. Senior Lieutenant Mikhail Dratvin, the sonar operator who had served with Captain Shurov during that first encounter in 1984, later transferred to the training command at Polyarny. His job was teaching new sonar operators how to evade detection. In 1988, during a lecture to students, Dratvin reportedly said, "I am teaching you skills that may no longer matter. When I began my career, we could hide in the ocean. The ocean was our friend, our protector. Now the ocean is transparent. The Americans can see us wherever we go. Your job is not to avoid detection. That is no longer possible. Your job is to survive despite being detected, to complete your mission knowing the enemy watches your every move. It is a different kind of warfare than what I learned." Some of his students later recalled that Dratvin looked exhausted as he spoke, as if the accumulated stress of knowing his profession had been fundamentally altered, had taken a physical toll. The financial cost of the technological arms race strained Soviet resources during a period when the economy was already under severe pressure. Developing improved anechoic coatings, ultra-quiet propulsion systems, and new submarine classes required billions of rubles. The Ministry of Defense allocated increasing percentages of the naval budget to anti-detection research. But each new countermeasure seemed to produce only marginal improvements while the Americans continued advancing their detection capabilities. Soviet naval leadership faced a strategic trap. They could not abandon submarine development because submarines remained essential to Soviet military doctrine. But continuing to build submarines that could be easily tracked seemed to waste resources on weapons that had lost their primary advantage. Admiral Chernavin proposed a radical solution in 1987. Instead of building more submarines, the Soviet Navy would focus on destroying American surveillance infrastructure. This meant developing anti-submarine warfare forces capable of hunting and sinking TAGOS ships. The proposal faced immediate opposition from other military branches who argued it would escalate the Cold War into actual conflict. Sinking unarmed surveillance vessels in international waters would be an act of war. The proposal was shelved, but its consideration revealed the desperation Soviet naval leadership felt. The end of the Cold War in 1991 brought changes that neither side had anticipated. As the Soviet Union collapsed, Russian naval forces underwent massive reductions. Submarine production virtually stopped. Many boats were decommissioned and scrapped. The submarine force that had numbered 378 vessels in 1985 shrank to fewer than 100 operational boats by 1995. American Surdas operations also scaled back. Though the technology continued development, the knowledge gained during the 1980s became the foundation for modern anti-submarine warfare doctrine. Today's systems are even more sophisticated, using synthetic aperture sonar, multistatic configurations, and artificial intelligence to track submarines with unprecedented accuracy. The transparent ocean that Soviet submariners feared has become reality. Post-Cold War interviews with Soviet veterans reveal the lasting psychological impact. Captain First Rank Boris Bagdasarian, who had surfaced his ballistic missile submarine and requested emergency return to base in 1984, retired from the Navy in 1991. In a 2001 interview with Russian naval historians, he reflected on his career. "We trained for a war we understood. Silent submarines, patient waiting, the advantage of stealth. Then in a span of months, everything changed. The Americans made the ocean transparent. It was as if we had trained to fight at night and suddenly the sun came up. We were exposed, vulnerable, blind while the enemy could see. That feeling never left me. Even today when I swim in the ocean, I imagine those sonar pulses, that invisible light revealing everything hidden in the depths." The technical legacy of Surdas extends beyond military applications. The same low-frequency acoustic technology now helps scientists study ocean temperature, track whale migrations, and search for underwater resources. The massive computing power required to process Surdas data drove advances in signal processing that benefited civilian industries. The lessons about how sound propagates through ocean water revolutionized marine biology and oceanography. But for the men who served in Soviet submarines during the 1980s, Surdas represents something more personal. It represents the moment their world changed, when the fundamental assumption underlying their service proved false. The ocean was not vast enough to hide in. Technology had eliminated the advantage of stealth. What Soviet submariners couldn't have imagined was that this transformation was permanent. Modern submarines are quieter than Victor III boats, but modern detection systems are exponentially more powerful than Surdas. The transparent ocean is not a temporary condition. It is the future of naval warfare. Captain Second Rank Viktor Shirov, whose trembling hands gripped the periscope housing on that March day in 1984, continued serving until 1989. He never fully adapted to the new reality. His fitness reports from 1985 onward note increasing stress and reluctance to take boats on patrol. In 1987, he requested transfer to shore duty. The request was approved. Shirov spent his final 2 years teaching at the Higher Naval Submarine School, training the next generation of officers who would have to operate in the transparent ocean. He died in 2018 at age 76. His obituary in the Russian Naval Veterans magazine noted his distinguished service but made no mention of that day when he first heard the impossible sonar that could find him 200 miles away. Some transformations are too personal to be reduced to official records. They live in memory, in the moment when confidence becomes doubt, when certainty becomes fear, when what you knew to be true is revealed as illusion. For Viktor Shirov and thousands of Soviet submariners like him, that moment came when they heard American sonar systems that shouldn't have existed, tracking them across distances that should have been impossible, turning the vast protective ocean into a prison of sound and light.